10,000 years ago, before the pyramids, before writing, before the wheel, before anyone had ever thought to call themselves Egyptian or Sumerian or anything at all. Someone stood on a patch of dry earth beside a spring in the Jordan Valley and decided to stay. Not for a season, not for a hunting trip, forever. That decision, made by people whose names we will never know, would eventually give rise to a settlement that some archaeologists consider the oldest continuously inhabited city on Earth. A place that has been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that its ruins now rise more than 20 feet above the surrounding plain, layer stacked on layer, each one a buried chapter of human ambition. We call it Jericho. And the deeper archaeologists dig into its mound, the stranger the story becomes. Because thousands of years before anyone built a pyramid, before anyone poured bronze or invented the plow, someone in Jericho built a wall. A massive stone wall, and beside it, a tower unlike anything else built anywhere in the world at that time. No one has ever fully agreed on why. This is the story of the place some call the first city on Earth. A story of survival, ambition, mystery, and the astonishing moment when human beings stopped wandering and decided, for the first time in our species' history, to put down roots and never leave. To understand why Jericho matters, you have to understand what the world looked like before it existed. For nearly all of human history, our ancestors moved. They followed herds, followed seasons, followed rivers rising and falling. Small bands of hunter-gatherers, rarely more than a few dozen people, carried everything they owned on their backs and slept under a different sky every few weeks. This was not a primitive failure to figure something out. It was, according to archaeological evidence, an extraordinarily successful way to live, refined over hundreds of thousands of years. It required no permanent shelter, no defended territory, no stored surplus that someone else might try to take from you. And then, sometime around 11,500 years ago, in a strip of land now called the Levant, something began to shift. The last ice age was ending. Glaciers that had locked up much of the planet's water were retreating, and the climate across the Near East was becoming warmer and, for a time, wetter. Wild wheat and barley spread across the hillsides in dense stands. Gazelle herds thickened in the valleys. In a small area near a natural spring at the edge of the Jordan Valley, conditions aligned in a way that made staying in one place suddenly make sense. That spring still exists today. Locals call it Ain-e-Sultan, the spring of the Sultan. It has never stopped flowing, not once, not for 11,000 years. Researchers believe it may be the single reason Jericho exists at all. In a landscape where water can mean the difference between life and death, a permanent freshwater source in the middle of an arid valley would have been almost impossible to ignore. People came for the water, and then, according to current research, something unusual happened. They didn't leave. The earliest layers of settlement at Jericho, belonging to a period archaeologists call the Natufian culture, show something remarkable for their time. Not a campsite, but the beginnings of permanence. Stone foundations, repeated use of the same hearths, the same burial spots over generations. This was not yet a city in any sense we would recognize, but it was something new in human experience. A single location, returned to, invested in, remembered. Why does this matter so much? Because for the overwhelming majority of the roughly 300,000 years our species has existed, no one had ever done this before. Not like this. Not with this permanence. And then, around 8,000 BCE, give or take a few centuries depending on which set of radiocarbon dates you trust, the people at Jericho did something that would change the trajectory of human history entirely. They started farming. This period, known to archaeologists as the pre-pottery Neolithic, is one of the most quietly revolutionary chapters in the human story, and Jericho sits right at its center. The residents began cultivating wild cereals deliberately, selecting and replanting seeds from the plants with the best yields. Emmer wheat, barley, legumes. They weren't inventing agriculture out of nowhere. According to archaeological evidence, Farming was emerging independently across several regions of the Near East around this same time. But Jericho offers one of the clearest, earliest, and best preserved windows into how it actually happened on the ground, in a real community, over real generations. Picture it: a cluster of round, mud brick houses pressed close together, their walls curved like the inside of a beehive, smoke rising from cooking fires, children running between structures that had never existed before this moment in history, because the very concept of a permanent neighborhood had never existed before this moment in history. The population grew. Estimates vary, but some researchers suggest that at its height during this period, Jericho may have housed several hundred people and possibly over 1,000. For context, that would have made it, by a wide margin, one of the largest concentrations of human beings anywhere on the planet at that time. A city, in every meaningful sense except one. They hadn't yet invented pottery. That technology was still to come. Which means everything from grain storage to cooking to hauling water had to be solved with baskets, skins, and stone. And it's in this same period, sometime around 8000 BCE, that the mystery at the heart of Jericho's story begins. Archaeologists digging into the base of the mound uncovered something almost unbelievable for its age. A massive stone wall, over 3 meters high in places, encircling part of the settlement. Built not from mud brick but from solid, quarried stone, an immense undertaking for a community with no metal tools, no wheeled transport, no draft animals to speak of. And built directly against this wall, a tower. A solid stone tower, over 8 meters tall, roughly the height of a modern 3-story building, with an internal staircase of 22 stone steps spiraling up through its core. It remains, to this day, one of the oldest freestanding monumental structures ever discovered anywhere on Earth. Older than Stonehenge by thousands of years. Older than the pyramids by thousands more. For decades, the explanation seemed obvious. A wall, a tower, a settlement worth defending. This had to be about warfare. Early humans, so the theory went, had built the world's first fortress, protecting their newfound wealth of stored grain from raiders. But the deeper archaeologists examined the evidence, the less that explanation seemed to fit. There is, according to current research, remarkably little evidence of warfare in the archaeological record of this period in the region. No mass graves, no widespread signs of violent conflict at other Neolithic sites nearby that would suggest Jericho needed defending against hostile neighbors. And the wall itself, when examined closely, presents a strange problem. It doesn't fully surround the settlement in the way you'd expect a defensive structure to. In several places, its layout doesn't logically align with repelling an attacking force at all. So archaeologists began asking a different question. What if the wall wasn't built to keep people out? One interpretation, proposed by some researchers, is genuinely unexpected. The wall and tower may have functioned as flood and erosion control. Jericho sits below hillsides that, during heavy seasonal rains, can send torrents of mud and debris rushing down toward the settlement. A well-placed wall could have protected the mud brick homes from being swept away entirely. It's a far less dramatic theory than a fortress under siege, but it fits the physical evidence in ways the warfare theory struggles to. Other historians suggest something else entirely, that the tower may have held ceremonial or religious significance. Excavations near its base uncovered a human burial. Some researchers have proposed the structure may have served as a gathering point for communal ritual, a monument not to defense, but to identity, unity, or belief. In a world without writing, without centralized government, without any of the institutions we associate with early states, a structure like this may have been one of the only ways a community could physically declare, "We are here, we are one people, and this place belongs to us." The evidence remains debated, and honestly, that uncertainty might be the most fascinating part of the whole story, because it forces us to sit with a genuinely humbling truth. 11,000 years is enough time to erase not just the memory of why something was built, but very nearly the ability to reconstruct the reasoning at all. We are looking at the physical remnant of a decision made by real people, with real concerns and real beliefs, and the context that would explain it to us has simply vanished. What we do know is this. The wall and tower represent an almost incomprehensible investment of labor for a community this early in human history. Some estimates suggest the tower alone would have required tens of thousands of hours of collective work, quarrying stone without metal tools, hauling it, shaping it, stacking it with precision. This wasn't the work of one family or even one generation. It required organization, cooperation on a scale that, as far as the archaeological record shows, had never before been necessary in human history. In other words, before Jericho had kings, before it had priests in any formal sense we'd recognize, before it had writing to record instructions or laws, its people had already discovered something profound. That working together at scale toward a shared and lasting goal could produce something no single person, no single family could ever build alone. That idea, arguably, is the true birth of civilization, not the wall itself, the cooperation that built it. Jericho's pre-pottery Neolithic period didn't last forever. Around 7,000 BCE, the settlement appears to have been abandoned for a time, for reasons that remain unclear. Climate shifts, resource depletion, and social upheaval have all been proposed as explanations, though none is confirmed. But what makes Jericho so remarkable in the archaeological record isn't just this one golden age. It's what happened next. People came back, again and again and again. Over the following millennia, Jericho was resettled, rebuilt, destroyed, and resettled once more, in a cycle that repeated itself so many times that the mound archaeologists excavate today, known as a tell, contains more than 20 distinct layers of settlement, stacked one atop another like the rings of an ancient tree. Each layer tells its own story. New pottery styles emerging around 6,000 BCE, changing burial customs, evidence of trade connections stretching as far as the Red Sea and the Anatolian highlands, hinting at a settlement that, even in its quieter periods, remained tied into a much wider world. By the Bronze Age, Jericho had grown into a fortified city in the fullest sense, complete with defensive walls, a phrase that, this time, the archaeological evidence supports without much ambiguity. It's this Bronze Age city and its dramatic fate that would eventually make Jericho one of the most famous place names in the ancient world, not primarily through archaeology, but through scripture. According to the biblical book of Joshua, the walls of Jericho famously came tumbling down after Israelite forces marched around the city for 7 days, blowing trumpets, before the fortifications collapsed entirely. It is one of the most iconic stories in religious tradition, retold for thousands of years in art, music, and worship. But when archaeologists examine what the ground actually reveals about this period, the picture becomes considerably more complicated. Excavations led in the 20th century, most notably by British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon, found that the specific Bronze Age walls that could plausibly correspond to this biblical narrative appear, based on pottery and radiocarbon evidence, to have already been destroyed centuries before the events described in Joshua are traditionally dated. Some historians suggest this points to the biblical account functioning as a later theological narrative, rather than a direct historical record of that specific era. Others argue that dating methods for this period carry enough uncertainty that a connection cannot be entirely ruled out, and continue to debate the chronology. This is important to say clearly. The archaeological evidence around Jericho's Bronze Age destruction remains genuinely debated among historians and archaeologists. Some interpretations lean one way, some the other. What can be said with confidence is that the city was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times across its long Bronze and Iron Age history, and that separating precise historical fact from later religious tradition, in a story this old, is often extraordinarily difficult. That difficulty doesn't make the story less meaningful. It simply means Jericho occupies a rare space where archaeology, history, and faith all meet, and don't always agree. What's easy to lose in a story this dramatic is the older, quieter miracle underneath it. Long before any wall fell to trumpets, real or symbolic, this was a place where actual human beings, 11,000 years ago, made a choice that changed the shape of our entire species. Consider what that choice actually required. It meant giving up the safety net of mobility, the ability to simply walk away from drought, disease, or conflict. It meant learning to live in close, permanent proximity with dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of other people, something our species had comparatively little practice doing. It meant developing new ways to store food, new ways to resolve disputes, quite possibly new belief systems to make sense of a way of life nobody had ever lived before. Every convenience and every complication of modern civilization, cities, agriculture, architecture, organized religion, social hierarchy, even the diseases that spread more easily when people live close together, all of it traces back, in some meaningful sense, to decisions first made in places like this. Jericho isn't necessarily unique in making that leap. Other early settlements across the Fertile Crescent, places like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey or Saddlehuruk in Anatolia, were undergoing their own transformations around similar timeframes, and researchers continue to debate exactly how these early centers relate to one another. But Jericho remains one of the earliest, longest-running, and most continuously inhabited examples we have physical evidence for, a nearly unbroken thread connecting the present day back to the very first chapter of settled human life. Today, modern Jericho still exists, a living city in the West Bank, home to tens of thousands of people who walk streets built above 11,000 years of continuous human history. Beneath their homes, beneath their markets and mosques and streets, lie the compressed remains of roughly 100 generations of people who came before them, all drawn, again and again, to the same patch of ground beside the same ancient spring. Archaeological work at the site continues even now, and with it, our understanding of Jericho's earliest chapters continues to shift. New excavation techniques, more precise radiocarbon dating, and fresh analysis of old finds keep reopening questions that once seemed settled. The purpose of the tower, the reason for the wall, the exact rhythm of abandonment and return that shaped the site across its earliest millennia. Every answer archaeologists uncover seems to generate two new questions in its place. Maybe that's fitting. A place this old was never going to give up its secrets easily. Jericho has survived flood, conflict, climate shifts, and the slow erosion of over 100 centuries, and in some sense it has outlasted every civilization that has ever claimed it, every empire that has marched through it, every story that has ever been told about it. Whether or not it holds the singular title of the world's first city is still, quite genuinely, an open question among historians, and depends heavily on exactly how you define the word city in the first place. But what's harder to dispute is this. Somewhere beneath the modern streets of Jericho lies the physical evidence of the moment our species first tried something radically new. The moment we stopped merely surviving on the land and started building something meant to last. So here's the question worth sitting with. If the very first city on Earth still can't fully explain why its founders built a tower that took tens of thousands of hours to raise, what does that tell us about how much of our own distant past we've actually managed to understand, and how much of it may simply be gone for good? What do you think that tower was really for? Let us know in the comments.